Welcome to this educational session where we'll find out all about automated and connected vehicles. For those of you that don't know, I'm Sean Hammond. I'm the ADM of Transportation Services Division in Alberta Transportation. I'm also the Alberta board member on the CCMTA's Board of Directors. So I'm going to be your moderator today, so I will keep my editorial comments to a minimum. I'll try anyway, okay? I'll try. You know me, Scott. Okay, the following presentations will last approximately 1 hour and will conclude with a question and answer period with our guest speakers. So please wait till the end of the presentations to pose questions. We're going to split it into two. Mark and Wendy will go up first, and then Greg and Karen will do the second half. So there'll be a split in the middle where you'll get some questions that there will be some time to ask questions. If you do have a question, please use the microphones so that everybody can hear the question. The name of the presentation for this session is Automated and Connected Vehicles and the Future. To discuss this topic, we have a panel of 4 speakers: Mark Francis from ICBC, Wendy Doyle from Alberta Transportation, Greg Overwater and Karen Ho from the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association. Greg has just slipped out to pick up some last-minute material for everybody, I think, or for himself.
Greg is actually from the Global Automakers Association, so collectively we're...
All right, well, we'll correct that as we go. I'll figure it out as I get to the bottom of the thing. All right. Our first 2 speakers, Mark and Wendy, will speak to the AV work, automated vehicles work, currently underway at CCMTA and in Canada to plan and prepare for an AV-CV future. Mark is the manager of provincial vehicle registration and licensing at the Insurance Bureau of Insurance Corporation of British Columbia, ICBC, and has worked for that organization for over 30 years. In addition to Mark's current role, in which he oversees vehicle registration licensing programs and policy for ICBC, Mark also co-chairs the CCMTA Automated Vehicles Working Group. He is also a member of the AV Best Practices Working Group for the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administration. He's also currently serving as past president of the Insurance Institute of BC and holds the designation of Fellow Chartered Insurance Professional. That's impressive. Thank you. Well done. Congratulations, Mark. Wendy Doyle is the Executive Director of the Office of Traffic Safety in the Ministry of Transportation in Alberta, and this office is dedicated to initiatives and tactics to reduce fatalities and serious injuries on Alberta's highways through research and evaluation, education and awareness, policy and legislation, and community mobilization. Safe system strategies and Vision Zero philosophies are at the core of her work. Wendy is a member of the Road Safety Research and Policy Committee for CCMTA, co-chairs the Autonomous AV Working Group, and is a member of AV Best Practices Working Group for AMVA. So, right up front, I believe, Mark, are you up first, or is Wendy? All right, ladies first. Wendy Doyle will speak first.
Can we get the other presentation put up, please?
You can give it your best shot.
Thank you. Well, welcome everyone. So little did Mark and I know 5 years ago, or about 5 years ago, when we started working on automated vehicles, that we would get the opportunity to ride in Jack, a test vehicle from Audi, or go to the Google campus and meet some of the technologists working on some of their technology, or go to M-City in Michigan and see where these vehicles are tested. Over the years, we've grown a tremendous depth of knowledge through our work with AMVA and CCMTA, and we're very happy to share some of that with you today. One thing of note, Mark and I have been working on this AV file for, well, I'll get into it, but for almost 5 years, and this is the first time we've ever presented together. And it's also the last time, because Mr. Francis is retiring. So he's unfortunately taking all that knowledge with him and leaving me in charge. But,
Good hands.
oh, thank you. Okay, so today we're going to give you a little bit of what we've been up to for the last 4.5 years. We're going to talk about the report that we've been working on. Mark is going to give you an example of some of the guidelines that are in that recommendations. And then, of course, we'll talk a little bit about next steps, and we'll be happy to take some questions at that point. So, as I said, we've been working on this since 2014. We have a CCMTA AV working group established where we have about 7 jurisdictions represented. And really, our mandate hasn't changed a whole lot since we started in 2014. We knew that we were tasked with building jurisdictional recommendations and really learning about this technology and working with industry as well to try to figure out what the best practices should be for jurisdictions. We did realize early on, though, that everyone had a different term for different things. So autonomous meant something to different people. Automated meant different things to different people. So we needed to have a government workshop, and we called it a level setting meeting, where we brought all of the jurisdictions in and talked about terminology, talked about basically the ins and outs of AVs so that everyone was on the same page and knew what the expectations and the risks were for their jurisdictions. In 2016, we developed a white paper, which is published on CCMTA's website. And again, this was just a snapshot in time as to what was going on in AVs and some of the implications to jurisdictions as well. Mark and I have been on the AMVA Autonomous Vehicle Working Group, which has really provided us with a ton of information that we've been able to bring back to Canada to develop our own guidelines. So AMVA just published their document in May. And again, CCMTA is working on our guidelines, and we will also have something published this summer, which is excellent. So the one thing we know is that this isn't just one area. It's a shared responsibility, so both federal, provincial, territorial, and municipalities have a role in automated vehicle technology and preparing for that technology. I'll get into the details a little bit later into what some of the specific rules are for each of those jurisdictions. But really what we're here to tell you about is, again, what we've been working on, so the major piece of work we've been working on. So there's 2 different documents that we'll be referencing today. One is the Canadian Jurisdictional Guidelines for the Safe Testing and Deployment of Highly Automated Vehicles. That is the document that CCMTA is leading with help across the country. The second is Testing Highly Automated Vehicles in Canada, Guidelines for Trial Organizations. This is the document that is being led by Transport Canada with assistance from CCMTA jurisdictions. The one thing to note is that the CCMTA work and the work that we're doing reports up to the PPSC Autonomous Vehicle Working Group, so that all of the work that we're doing is then reported up to the Council of Deputy Ministers and then the Council of Ministers, so that we're all working cooperatively across the country. So the 2 different documents have different audiences and different scopes. So the first being the CCMTA guidelines document, as I mentioned, was based pretty heavily, if not almost completely, on the work that AMVA has led and has recently published. So thank you again to AMVA for having us on that committee and contributing to amazing work. So the audience for that is specifically for jurisdictions and for law enforcement as well, for anyone who is administering or regulating the control of AVs in their jurisdiction. The scope is specific to the deployment and testing of automated driving systems, so ADS technology. Transport Canada's guidelines are specifically for trial organizations, and it is for anyone wanting to do trials in Canada in the CV-AV world. And again, these are Canadian-wide guidelines for the safe conduct of trials. So that's the audience and scope of these 2 different documents. Sticking specifically with the CCMTA guidelines, the key elements of our document are this. So we wanted to make sure that the automated vehicle taxonomy and definitions, terms and technologies are clear. We've learned that because different words mean different things, we wanted to make sure that we were sticking with internationally recognized terminology such as SAE definitions. We, of course, clarified roles and responsibilities, who does what or should do what in the AV world. We talk about some considerations for the testing and deployment of ADS vehicles, the guidelines for testing and the guidelines for deployment specifically, and we go into some law enforcement and safety considerations. So what are the types of issues that law enforcement will have to be prepared for as well? So an important goal of this guidelines document is to establish common, clear, and consistent language, as I already mentioned. So we start with a preface that provides internationally accepted vehicle classification systems and definitions with terms commonly used to identify and differentiate between various types of driving systems. And again, we adopted SAE's international guidelines, or J3016. So in the document itself, there are guiding principles. So we know that ADS technology is moving swiftly, yet we know that legislation takes time and can be highly consultative, and it's important to be nimble in this process. So it is clear that there's a need for a well-planned approach to manage ADS vehicles and the integration within the transportation system. So the purpose and rationale for our guidelines is to create a pathway of consistency across jurisdictions. The last thing we want is a patchwork from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and not have industry have the ability to test beyond a single jurisdiction's borders. We want to encourage and enable the earliest safe introduction of the technology, confirm and clarify roles and responsibilities of each level of government, demonstrate jurisdictional awareness and understanding of the technology, and promote public acceptance, confidence, and adoption. Again, create common language and terms, and work towards interoperability. So lots of information on this slide, but it's a snapshot of what is actually in the trials document as well as the CCMTA guidelines as to who is responsible for what. So the federal areas of responsibility are between Transport Canada and ISED, and the provincial and territorial areas of responsibility are on the right-hand side, and municipalities' rules are there as well. So I won't read all of this specifically, but again, we know that Transport Canada is responsible for motor vehicle safety research and publication specifically on motor vehicles. Municipalities are specific to traffic control, bylaws, and managing passenger transportation within their jurisdictions. And of course, us at CCMTA, the provinces and territories are responsible for the driver licensing, vehicle registration, etc. So that is a snapshot of who's at the table when it comes to adopting AVs. I will now pass it on to Mark to continue.
Thanks, Wendy. So in terms of how the report will be used, the jurisdictional guidelines document provides a series of considerations and recommendations that will support Canadian jurisdictions, manufacturers, and other entities in their planning and rollout of ADS vehicles. It focuses on governance, and overall it delves into the various disciplines of vehicle registration, driver licensing, and law enforcement, with the purpose of providing a point-in-time set of voluntary recommendations for Canadian jurisdictions to use in developing testing programs, if desired, and preparing for the deployment of the technology. And actually, we're seeing the deployment today with Level 3 vehicles, the Cadillac CT6 with their Super Cruise highway driving technology. Might have seen the commercials, and also soon to come the 2019 Audi A8. So in relation to governance, which is Chapter 3 of the document, I'll just provide some examples of what we have included in the report. So we suggest that the establishment of an ADS committee to address ADS testing and deployment, and the committee should include members from a broad range of governmental and private sector stakeholders having an interest in or responsibilities related to ADS. Also, it's important to identify a lead agency to manage the ADS committee and its work. Typically, that is the Motor Transport Administrator or Department of Motor Vehicles. And the ADS committee should develop strategies for addressing testing and deployment of ADS in their jurisdiction, balancing the protection of road safety with enabling technological innovation. And an example of a governance recommendation for manufacturers and other entities, we're recommending manufacturers and other entities interacting cooperatively with and responding to ADS jurisdictional committee questions and requests, and also be included as that group of interested stakeholders, as it's the collaboration, again, is a really key issue. So moving on to testing, there's a number of sections that we have in this area of the report. We break it into vehicle credentialing considerations and also driver licensing considerations. And under vehicle credential considerations, we've got a section on the application and permit for manufacturers or other entities to test vehicles on public roadways, vehicle permitting and registration, license plates, financial responsibility, and compliance of ADS trial vehicles with the federal Canadian Motor Vehicle Safety Standards. For driver licensing, we've got driver and passenger roles defined and driver licensing requirements for testing by manufacturers. So a couple of examples suggest that the development of an internal process that includes an application for manufacturers to test on public roadways within the jurisdiction, and include provisions for the suspension or revocation of any permit to test should the permit holders violate conditions. Also holding test users responsible for violations of existing traffic laws, subject to existing legal processes, and require manufacturers and other entities testing ADS vehicles to apply for and be issued vehicle-specific permits prior to testing on public roadways. Moving to deployment. So this is another chapter within the document. It's chapter 5, and we've also developed a section that relates to vehicle credentialing considerations and also driver licensing considerations for deployment. And there's commonalities in the elements. We've got vehicle permits for deployed ADS vehicles, vehicle registration, license plates, ADS information on the new vehicle information statement, or NIVIS, or vehicle birth certificate. Financial responsibility here as well, also federal compliance. Driver licensing goes a bit deeper, so we also have the driver and passenger roles defined here as well. Driver training for consumers of deployed vehicles, ADS driver training for motor vehicle agency examiners, driver education programs and private instructors, driver license skill tests with ADS vehicles, and also endorsements and restrictions for deployed vehicles. And an example of some of the recommendations, we suggest establishing uniform language, which will benefit law enforcement and the motor transport administrator and other stakeholders for testing ADS vehicles. This uniform language should include the use of acronyms and terms such as ADS for Automated Driving System and ADS vehicle. We also recommend placing a notation on the registration and electronic record by means of an ADS flag and additional corresponding ADS level field for vehicles that have the capability to operate at levels 3, 4, or 5. And also placing an altered or A status on vehicles not equipped with automated technologies by the OEM, but having aftermarket automated technologies. I know there's been lots of discussion today about data gaps, metrics, performance. So I think there's really an opportunity here that I want to highlight. That in relation to ADS vehicles, it's going to be very important to track data for a number of reasons, and provide an example. So registration authorities have the opportunity to be a key source of data for actuaries. The Casualty Actuarial Society in the US just released this month a report entitled Automated Vehicles and the Insurance Industry, A Pathway to Safety, the Case for Collaboration. I think there's a common theme here in reference to collaboration by many of the organizations that have put together material for highly automated vehicles. So I've pulled out some key quotes just from that report. It's imperative for the various parties and stakeholders, manufacturers, technologists, policymakers, attorneys, risk managers, insurers, and actuaries, to cooperate during the development and rollout of AV technology and address collaboratively issues such as defining and collecting appropriate data, considering potential liability systems, and establishing appropriate performance benchmarks by which to evaluate AV technologies. Clean, consistent data are essential for proper analytical evaluation, which is necessary in order to quantify the risks associated with AVs. Related to data, and I think one of the most important statements, currently it is very difficult and sometimes impossible for insurers to distinguish between vehicles with and without advanced technology. Unless this changes, improved performance will take even longer to be reflected in premium discounts. There are also comments about premium inaccuracies, delaying the introduction and update of the technology, which delays the benefits we will see. They agree that we need to work together to achieve the earliest safe introduction and adoption of the technology as possible. So there's a link as to how motor vehicle administrators can help support the insurance side to help bring about early adoption. Also got a recommendation for manufacturers that manufacturers and other entities should notify the jurisdiction of any change in the ADS level of the vehicles, for example, through an over-the-air software download. So moving on to Chapter 6, recommendations for law enforcement and transportation safety. And I just wanted to point out that this section of the report, we combine testing and deployment together, whereas we've broken out for vehicle registration, driver licensing, testing, and deployment as separate chapters. And the items that are included in Chapter 6 include crash incident reporting, criminal activity, distracted driving and fatigue, establishing operational responsibility and law enforcement implications, first responder safety, assisting first responders and transportation safety investigators through vehicle identification, law enforcement and first responder training, vehicle response to emergency vehicles, manual traffic controls and atypical road conditions, system misuse and abuse, and adherence to traffic laws. And we're very grateful to Chuck Cox from the CACP, who really helped us develop the law enforcement material for our report. And a couple of examples, jurisdictions should develop and standardize the reporting process to document ADS crashes and incidents beyond the Provincial Highway Traffic Act and Motor Vehicle Accident Report. The ADS crash or incident report should identify the ADS vehicle is being operated in autonomous mode or non-autonomous mode. And Transport Canada and jurisdictions should explore additional options to collect and or link the NCDB National Collision Database collision data with other data sources that may contain the ADS level vehicle information, including working together to build such data sources where they do not already exist. And a couple of recommendations for manufacturers and other entities, that they should require the designated test users to pass a background check, including but not limited to driver history review and a criminal history check prior to being authorized to operate a test vehicle. And that should be relevant background issues. Manufacturers and other entities should ensure ADS vehicles leave an electronic fingerprint that can allow tracing of input data to whoever initiated them. And that's really in relation to potentially unoccupied or remotely operated vehicles. And the objective is to find out who told it to do what and when. So a couple of key points to take away. Jurisdictions should consider the recommendations within their legislative process, which will likely result in changes to laws, regulations, and policies. And we are consulting with manufacturing associations and recognize it's critical to be collaborative and work together. This is an area of the report which we are finalizing, and we're pleased that we've been able to extend the previously very short consultation period by a couple of weeks. And we want to ensure an optimal relationship to achieve the most safe and robust testing and deployment conditions. So in terms of next steps, we'll continue the consultation with key industry stakeholders, and we expect to be completed that by mid-June. We'll be seeking approval of the guidelines from the CCMTA board and provide the guidelines to the Council of Deputy Ministers in July of 2018, and following that will be publication on the CCMTA website. And we'll continue to participate and contribute to other organizational efforts to prepare for the testing and deployment of AVs and CVs, attending conferences, seminars, other forums focused on that. And we also want to update the report periodically as technology advances and address such areas as commercial vehicles, rideshare ownership models. And so it's going to be a living document. We don't have all the answers right now. Privacy and cybersecurity are a couple of the key issues that need to be managed as the technology further evolves and deploys. So in conclusion, the document provides voluntary guidance and recommendations that balance public safety with advancement of vehicle innovations that have the potential, very high potential, to reduce crashes, fatalities, injuries, and property damage. And as jurisdictions address the use of highly automated vehicles, they may use these guidelines to ensure they are addressing key components while giving consideration to creating a consistent regulatory approach across jurisdictions and demonstrating appropriate leadership and preparedness to promote a collaborative and constructive environment for innovation in Canada. I'd also like to thank AMVA again for their work. We could not have done so much in such a short period of time. They allowed us to use their document even before it was published, so it was really helpful. So thanks again to the AMVA team. And I think we're going to pause here. Or
So before we get into the next part of the session, are there any questions for either Mark or Wendy? Okay, seeing none? Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Well, we'll try again. Okay, here I go. Our second set of speakers, Greg and Karen, will share current and emerging AV CV initiatives from the vehicle manufacturing sector. Greg Overwater is the Director of Technical and Regulatory Affairs at Global Automators of Canada, the trade association representing the Canadian interests of 15 leading international automakers, where he spends his days alternately helping member companies navigate the complicated maze of automotive safety and environmental regulation and representing their perspectives on important issues to governments, NGOs, and other public policy stakeholders. He's been a professionally licensed engineer in Ontario since 2000 and holds a Bachelor of Aerospace Engineering from Ottawa's Carleton Engineering. And this is automated connected vehicles, not airborne vehicles. Okay, we'll get there. Karen joined the CVMA in 2007, working on the Facility, Environment and Energy, Occupational Health and Safety, and WSIB and Vehicle Safety Committees. She's responsible for developing consensus-based positions on behalf of manufacturers assembling vehicles in Ontario. Karen is a graduate of engineering science from the University of Toronto. So I'm not sure who's going first. Is it Karen or Greg? It looks like it's Greg is going to launch us into the vehicle manufacturer side. So Greg, it's all yours.
I'll try not to spill that. So green forward. All right. So just spread this up a little bit. All right. Does everyone can hear me all right? Okay. Well, thanks very much for the introduction, Sean, and thanks very much to the folks at CCMTA for allowing us to come in to speak to you today. Karen and I, we were putting together this presentation. We were wondering how we can find enough meat for you folks to chew on without getting too far into the weeds, and also not get too far into the weeds. That's somebody who's a real expert, subject matter expert on some of this stuff will stand up and debate me on it. So we're happy to be here today. We appreciate the opportunity, and thanks very much for for the presentation earlier. I think you're going to find in our presentation some common themes, specifically around collaboration. So I'll kick it off, and then when we get to that section, Karen will take over. So we've gone through the introduction, so I won't spend too much time on this slide, and we'll just get to the meat of the matter. So presumably, most people in here have had some familiarity with automated vehicle terminology and the levels as they're defined by SAE standard J3016. It's currently 5 levels. Most organizations have kind of gotten around to using those defined levels. We're hoping that that terminology will proliferate throughout the world. I have some suspicion that we'll have some difficulty with the public trying to get them to talk in SAE levels, but for the purposes here, we'll do just fine. Just to be really clear, where we are right now, if you're not really super familiar, we're in that 1, transitioning to 2, looking down the road to 3. There are actually some level 4 vehicles out there. They're not on road. They're typically what you would find in airports, closed circuits, things where you don't have other people in the way, essentially. So level 4 is coming. It will depend on where. That's when you think about that. So moving forward. So why deploy AVs? Well, really it comes down to opportunity. We have opportunity for OEMs and road safety professionals, for service providers, and for drivers and occupants. So from our perspective as manufacturers, we have a regulated requirement, as also a moral imperative, to make our product as safe to use as possible, and as safe to misuse as possible, because that does happen. Recent studies have shown that up to 90% plus fatalities and injuries due to driver error. So what can we do with the technology to minimize that? There are collision benefits, or should I say collision avoidance benefits for drivers, passengers, cyclists, and pedestrians, and that equally applies with collision avoidance, which is not the case when you talk about collision mitigation, airbags and seat belts. That tends to focus the protective measure on the driver and the occupant. Collision avoidance benefits everyone on the road, potentially, especially when those individuals, cyclists, vehicles are connected. We have opportunity for ride sharing, automated taxis, and a lot of that activity in our industry is being driven by that disruption right now. That allows the potential to increase vehicle utilization. So instead of parking your vehicle for 10 hours a day and using it for 1, you have the opportunity to employ those vehicles for a greater cycle of activity. It'll be interesting to see what impact that has in our industry over the years, as vehicles you normally hold on to for 5, 7, 8, 10 years get mileage on them a lot quicker, potentially. They may turn over faster. There is the potential to reduce greenhouse gases and fuel consumption. That all depends, again, on what happens in the road use of these vehicles. If a lot more vehicles get onto the road that aren't currently on the road, potentially the inventory can go up, the GHG inventory can go up. On the other hand, if you utilize the resources more effectively, you can potentially drive it down. Interestingly, the shared ride service industry is looking to expand potentially up to the 250 billion mark by about 2030. That's what Goldman Sachs has recently released. That's from about 5 billion today. So obviously those companies see enormous potential, and it's that opportunity which is driving a lot of the work in automated vehicles. There's an increased accessibility for the elderly, the disabled, and for those whom either vehicle ownership's not practical, or perhaps they're no longer able to operate a vehicle, but they still need to get to work, they still need to live their lives. And we have the last mile option for public transit. This is, in a sprawling country like Canada, you have big cities, stretched transit systems, they can't get everywhere. Cities have to determine where they're going to put their money in public transit. This allows, and by this I mean shared ride sharing, allows kind of a last mile option whereby you have additional options for those short trips from people's homes to the public transit hubs. So, smart cities, we can see probably the rise of ride sharing playing a part in transit interconnectedness. But it's not all roses. Like in any other industry where you see disruption, there will be job losses probably over time. Some, for example, will be in the driving side of that. That'll be taxi drivers, potentially the folks who are driving the Ubers now. When we've seen recent comments in other countries, particularly the leaders of developing nations, we've had Prime Minister Modi in India say ride sharing will never come to India because it would put too many people who rely on driving as their daily bread out of work. And I think it was just yesterday that President Erdogan in Turkey, I think, basically revoked Uber's ability to operate in the country, or is planning to, for much the same reason, I take it. So, moving quickly through this slide, I think most of you have some basic idea of what automated vehicles or automated driving systems look like, and what connected vehicle technologies are. Basically, they are complementary. We see them kind of being developed at the same time, but they are two distinct streams of research and innovation. The automated vehicle systems, of course, are a sense, plan, act approach. So, vehicle senses something, could be sign, could be another vehicle, could be barrier in the road, uses artificial intelligence and machine learning to decide what's the best approach to dealing with that in the environment, and then makes the adjustments to the vehicle's acceleration, steering, braking. It doesn't require infrastructure. There's not necessarily any need for road sharing of traffic obstacles. And crash avoidance essentially is limited to line of sight, because it's whatever the sensors can see is what they can react to. So if you're in an intersection facing a vehicle and there's another vehicle behind it that is going to make some maneuver, your vehicle may or may not be able to detect that. Connected vehicle technologies, on the other hand, are dealing with the wireless communication between vehicles and infrastructure, and vehicles, potentially pedestrians and cyclists. It allows, essentially, for automated vehicle technologies to maximize their benefit. If the vehicles are talking to each other, you can see and you can determine that there's a vehicle coming over a hill out of line of sight that may be obscured by a line of traffic on a turning lane. So they are two independent but complementary lines of research and development right now. Now, there's a lot on this slide, and don't worry about taking too much of it in. I put most of it here in case it gets distributed. But basically, there are two major competing technologies out there right now. There's what's commonly referred to as DSRC. That's based on the 802.11p standard, which is itself an extension of the 802.11a standard, which you may have heard of before, because it's very much an older Wi-Fi standard. So we've had A, B, G, N. So it's an older technology in the sense that it was originally provisioned for the purpose of safety messaging for vehicles in the 5.9 gigahertz ITS space, but essentially it continues to be the standard that most manufacturers are looking to, even as a newer technology, cellular V2X, has come to light. So there are essentially advantages and disadvantages to both. You have a little bit higher range with cellular V2X. It is a little bit newer. You have a higher bandwidth out of the gate with 5G. 4G LTE really wasn't a viable technology, or arguably not a viable technology in the space because of latency issues and bandwidth issues and handoff between devices and nodes. But with 5G, it kind of is an all new ball game, and you see some manufacturers starting to back that, but at the same time, the 802.11p standard is, to my understanding, being looked at by IEEE, and they're looking to upgrade the bandwidth capabilities of that. So you have two lines of technology here. Neither of them are really standing still, but because there's two competing technologies, we haven't seen a lot of movement on the regulatory side to standardize around one or the other. My understanding is probably in the next year we'll see the US possibly come to the industry with a mandate. It may be one, or it may be both. AT&T is one company looking at the interoperability between those two standards to see can they communicate to each other. If so, what are the limitations? But essentially, you know, we do have, it's I wouldn't say a format war, but we've seen it before in other types of products where you have option A and option B. They both have their advantages and disadvantages. It's not yet quite clear whether one is technically superior to the other. But that's essentially why we haven't seen a lot of motion on that. Now, this slide, I don't know if you can, you probably can't read it at all from where you are. But what it essentially does is provide a good overview of where driver assistance systems, vehicle automation, vehicle connectivity, and mobility services are. It's pulled from another source, but it's got a kind of a timeline across the top, and we're pretty close to that so far. I mean, you can see on the vehicle automation side, level 1, 2, 3, and 4, about a quarter of the way down the chart. Fairly accurate to date. You're starting to see level 3 be pushed back a little bit. Level 4, you know, we probably will see some product coming to market at the, you know, for very specific uses in the next few years. You've probably seen there's a couple of announcements out by various manufacturers saying within the 2021-2022 timeframe, a demonstration model might come to market, but we're not talking widespread deployment. And as you talk about level 2 to level 3 and level 3 to level 4 and eventually up to level 5, you're really dealing with an exponential kind of curve of challenges. You're going beyond simply assisting the driver to taking over the entire driving task. The operational domain is going from very limited to very broad, meaning the vehicle has to be able to account for every type of road surface, signage, different types of barriers, and when you get to level 5, you know it's going to have to interact with road crews, emergency personnel, and deal with all of those types of situations without driver intervention. So level 5 is probably, you know, it's not worth really talking about too much at this point because it is, even in our estimation, so far down the road in research and development that it's beyond consideration at this point. Level 4, because it's in a very limited operational design domain, meaning vehicle can operate independently but in very limited circumstance and very limited environment. That's something more we can consider because as manufacturers and or users, you can essentially control the environment, so you control the risk. Level 2 and 3, that's where we're heading right now, and as you've heard, that's potentially, I don't want to use a danger point, but it is definitely a risk point we have to manage all together as manufacturers, governments, researchers, and just people in the public. It's going to require a lot of driver training because people are going to make assumptions about what the technology can do without necessarily educating themselves. Manufacturers can do so much with the manuals, with, you know, deployment. People come to pick up their vehicles. Sometimes now there's 1 or 2 or 3 separate appointments that manufacturers will make with those people to inform them of the technologies in their vehicle. But you can only absorb so much. People only have so much patience. So you have to make up the gap with driver training, probably with public awareness to some degree. But at the end of the day, we've got a gap between, say, level 2 and level 4 that we all have to manage. And that's going to be the challenge that we all face, particularly when the technology is changing very quickly, and so much so that it's not really practical in most cases to have strictly defined regulation. So Karen will talk to that and what efforts we're undertaking now and what we hope to achieve with you folks in the coming days and years. And with that, I'll leave off, and probably I'm more than halfway through the time allotment, but I'm trying not to speak too quickly. So Karen, please take.
Thanks, Greg. So when Brad approached Greg and I to do a presentation as part of the education session, he did mention that there's a lot of interest about the collaborations that are taking place in the industry. And I think you've seen a lot of announcements. I think just last week, Waymo announced another up to, 62,000 vehicles with FCA. And there was a huge input of venture capitalist funding to GM's program by SoftChoice to the tune of, I think, $2.5 billion. So I guess what we're trying to show here is that collaboration is something that's kind of intrinsic to the auto sector. We've been doing it for a very, very long time across different stakeholders with academia in terms of research, throughout our supply community, with standards organizations. Our members are all very involved with that work. Now more and more with tech companies as well as government, and also amongst ourselves through cross-sectoral groups. So you've seen these in the past, and the models are changing. There's so many different models also in the new AV world. So we see kind of procurement type relationships such as the Waymo FCA. I think Land Rover also has a contract with Waymo now. We also see auto companies purchasing other companies. For example, GM purchasing Cruise Automation, taking that in-house. There's also sharing of software. I believe the new Mercedes level, some of their new advanced safety technologies utilize NVIDIA as a key supplier. And I'm sure there's a ton of academic research. I think there's a there's the APMA car out there, as well as projects with research facilities. That's all just to say that there's a lot going out there. I couldn't tell you the specifics of all of them. There's so many, but it happens on all the different levels. And again, between tech companies, between traditional automotive company suppliers, software, it's a never-changing world. Oh, sorry, better? That being said, there's still a great deal of cross-sectoral work that still remains. There's a lot of items up here. I don't want to go into detail with a lot of them, but areas such as privacy, very important. We recognize that. Cybersecurity, this is actually a pretty important priority area. I think this is an area where we recognize that there are a lot of consumer concerns, and so it's taken very seriously by our members and the manufacturers. We design for security. We design for defense, there's incident response, and then also monitoring detection to make sure that we're ahead of the game on this. And we also do this collaboratively, to the previous slide, through a cross-sectoral group called the Auto ISAC. So it is an industry group, and it's an interesting case where people, regardless of the competitiveness across our sector, we recognize this is such an important program that issue that we've come together as a group to try to proactively identify issues, address issues, and also establish best practices for the sector to use to create that confidence in the systems. There's also outstanding questions about risks from liability and how that will work, especially since vehicles might actually become more of a service than a personally owned vehicle. Spectrum in DSRC, Greg spoke to this a little bit in terms of NHTSA potentially coming out with a rule. So one of the challenges with connected vehicles is to get the real safety benefits. You really need mass adoption. And to do that, perhaps you might need a regulatory mandate to do that, to get that mass adoption. And there's a lot of factors at play right now, notwithstanding some of the political issues down in the States, but there is the competing technologies in terms of DSRC versus 5G and some of those new technologies that are coming out. So that's all kind of to be seen. That being said, our members are all very committed to this technology because of the safety benefits that they provide, and some have already started putting these technologies into the vehicles without a mandate. So it is coming, but still a lot of outstanding questions. Insurance, of course, is still an outstanding question, and there's a lot of other factors that we still have to consider in the design of these vehicles, including how they interact with people, the needs of standards, regulations, best practices, and of course the role of provincial laws. So that being said, there's a lot of continuing research in different areas like AI and these new topics that are coming to the forefront. And all of these issues really need to be further discussed and addressed in order to build consumer confidence. Ultimately, it's about consumer acceptance, right? And these are all areas that we have to cover and flesh out before we can build that consumer acceptance. So, that being said, we still have a long way to go. There's some recent studies. I think the Traffic Research Institute Foundation study in 2016 shows that, I'm not sure if you can see that, but something like 60 to 70% of people are not ready to have these type of vehicles or these technologies in their vehicles. So there's still a lot to do in terms of consumer awareness, understanding what these technologies are, their limitations. I think that's part of the consumer acceptance message and what they need to understand. And the other piece is it's consumer acceptance and awareness is also very transient in time. So there's an AA study chart to the right that kind of shows over time how much it can change just with news and things that you're hearing in the media. And so I think that's why it's very, very, very important for us to all collaborate together and provide that messaging and that consumer awareness as a collective, all as safety professionals. And to your point, data is a piece of that, right? Understanding what it means. I think it can be a little bit tricky right now that we're in the testing phase because the data isn't necessarily reflective of real-world situations. In fact, in a lot of tests, vehicles are pushed to extreme limits that might not be kind of the per norm. So I think you have to be very careful about that and how that data is presented, especially in the test phases right now, and how it might affect the consumer acceptance or attitude towards AVs. So I think there's a lot of work there to be done as a collective. Moving on to consumer attitudes. So how do we work together to prepare for AVs? Because I think we all have a stake in this game. As Greg talked about before, the technology is still changing, and it's changing really, really quickly. I don't think we've seen this type of change in our sector for a very long time. So there needs to be flexibility and nimbleness in our approach. I think, as Greg said, sometimes perhaps guidelines and best practices are a good way to provide that baseline while we contemplate what's coming forward and as the technology is still settling in. As part of that, I think it's really important to engage stakeholders, all stakeholders, really early and really often. As an auto sector, we want to work collaboratively with the government and other folks on providing an environment that will facilitate the deployments in a safe manner. I'd say that part of that is, and I think CCMT has done a really good job of leading in Transport Canada and trying to provide that common forum to coordinate efforts to try to remove barriers. So I think the jurisdictional guidelines will help in terms of identifying some common issues. And as well as their role in increasing education, as we talked about before, enhancing public acceptance. I think we constantly talk about this common language one because it's very important. I think it's really, really good that that was one of the prime issues that the document dealt with, and that might change over time too, and I think we'll just need to work together as stakeholders on that. And that all leads to continued consistency and collaboration. As Wendy mentioned, we don't want a patchwork. Our cars are crossing borders across provinces, but also north and south, so we have to think outside of just Canada. And along with that, we really need to stay close to the US federal and state guidelines because of the shared borders. So thank you, Amba, for your work and sharing that with us here to use. So in the near term, and just thinking in terms of what else as a sector, as the manufacturers, we would, that would help us in our work. I think one of the things that would be really helpful is to have a clear roadmap and a framework of all these pieces that come together. So jurisdictional guidelines are one piece, testing guidelines for organizations are one piece, but it'd be really helpful to issue a federal framework, our roadmap, our path forward, similar to the US NHTSA's Automated Driving Systems 2.0 that was issued in September of last year. And as part of that, I know a lot of work has gone into the CCMTA jurisdictional guidelines, and as you mentioned, we are taking a look at it. I think it would be helpful until we have the overall framework and how all the different pieces fit together. It'd be useful to keep that as a draft document or a working document until we have that overall framework, just again to maintain consistency, which has been very good. to date, but as you know, things are changing very fast. So that would be our recommendation, and again, to continue engaging with manufacturers and the other entities moving forward, and everyone in the room, because we all have a stake in it, and I think it all impacts us in different ways, so we need to understand how those pieces will all fit together. So overall, I think Canada's pretty well positioned. We have a lot of the building blocks in place. I think KPMG did a study this year, and Canada's ranked 7th out of about 20 jurisdictions, so we're in a pretty good place. I think one of the areas that the study highlighted was kind of the government support and willingness, so we commend everyone in the room for that. And yeah, I guess just looking forward, I think more dialogue, more collaboration, more discussions to come. Greg, did you want to add anything?
No, I think you've covered it all off very well. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you for everyone.
Okay, at this time, I'm going to open up for questions for Karen or for Greg.
I'm Penny from SGI. I'm just curious, any jurisdictions that have winter that have done any testing for the AV so far, or is it too early?
Use the mic for translation.
You want to take it?
A lot of the testing, there's a lot of testing already in the U.S., and a lot of the U.S. states do have winters as hard as ours, so a lot of that testing is already taking place. I think there's opportunities still in Canada.
Yeah, it's partly influenced by the fact that a lot of the manufacturing test facilities are based in the U.S., so they do that close to those facilities and those researchers. But like with anything, you go with an easy scenario first, so you test in the desert where the weather doesn't change, and then you test in the rain, and then you test in the snow, and then you test in the middle of the forest and near a lake in the snow. So we're probably getting to that point in time where you're going to see more extreme level testing.
All right, Colin.
Is this on? Hello, hello.
Testing.
Hello?
Hello, Colin, you're there.
My question is for Greg and or Karen. Greg, slide 5, Karen, slide 2 regarding V2V, V2I, data sharing. What sort of discussions are underway regarding the biometrics of a vehicle, emitting such as the electronic VIN number in short-range communication? So for example, in law enforcement, we could be able to capture that information as vehicles are traveling down the road. So not only a vehicle talking to the vehicle, knowing that it's there, but also just kind of gathering that information or emitting that information. Is there any work groups or discussions surrounding that activity?
So there is, so around the data, there's a lot of discussion around securities, credentials management systems, and I think that's still ongoing. I don't think there's a solution. Sorry, there's a.
Come on, I'll get you.
Just saying on the information moving between vehicles, for example, for the V2V, there is a lot of discussion in the States about securities credential management systems, who should do that, what the protocols are. So I don't think they've landed on anything yet, so it's still coming.
Is it possible from the OEMs to broadcast a VIN number electronically in a short-range environment? Does that technology currently exist?
I couldn't speak to the specifics.
Yeah, you remember my warning about getting into the weeds too far? Yeah. Does the technology exist? Probably. I mean, they're working on technology now for, and very shortly probably coming to market on wirelessly charging your cell phone in a car within the range of the body of the vehicle. So could you transmit externally? Sure. For what range? It could be potentially part of DSRC safety messaging, I suppose. But I don't know if anyone's working on that specifically. I think that's probably one of those application-specific things that they're going to work on once they get the standards and protocols worked out. So I'm sorry I can't answer that more specifically. Maybe someone else could, but I'll take it back with me, and if you give me your contact information, I'll look into it and I'll see if I can find something for you. Thank you.
So I'm going to just add on to that. I think this also kind of interplays in the discussions that still need to be had, because we have to balance, data privacy also with the safety benefits and broadcasting things. So it's one I don't think we have a solution for today.
Would you like to ask Mr. Roscoe from Saskatchewan whether or not he has a question? Andy, do you have a question?
Andy, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Okay, so most of the, or a high percentage of collisions between light vehicles and commercial vehicles are because of the light vehicle doing something in error, right? And the ability for the commercial vehicle to respond quick enough. Are there trends in how the CV or AV technologies are like, so is there kind of a move afoot in the commercial vehicle side to deploy technologies that could make them more responsive to the light vehicle driver? Or is a lot of the work that's being done being focused on the light vehicle side? I don't know if you understand my question.
Yeah, I think I do. I think from my members' point of view, their research and their development is focused on passenger vehicles. That being said, with things like vehicle connectivity, that gives you the advanced warning, right? If a vehicle's braking very quickly or if someone's coming in doing something odd, right, as you said. But I'm not aware myself of specifically any of that interaction.
Yeah. Some of my, well, a particular member that comes to mind, Mercedes-Benz, I mean, they play in both the fields of heavier truck and light duty. I do not doubt for a second that the research that they undertake and the efforts that they make don't get shared between the divisions. I don't know specifically if an action like that's being undertaken, but as Karen mentioned, on the V2 vehicle on the vehicle-to-vehicle technology, not only is awareness of a vehicle braking part of that messaging, but also in some cases can include rate of deceleration, rate of acceleration. So on that basis, an intelligent transport truck could make the appropriate reaction. Again, it's probably one of those further downstream things, and I probably at the university research level right now, maybe some company-sponsored research, but I don't think it's part of the mainstream conversation right now, to my knowledge.
That's good.
Anybody else? All right. Thank you all for your participation. I hope you enjoyed the session. If you have downloaded the annual meeting app, we invite you to rate and provide your feedback directly in the app. You can do so by clicking on the session's description. We're videotaping the educational sessions, and they will be available within a few weeks of the annual meeting for viewing on the CCMTA YouTube channel. Delegates will receive an email link once the videos are online. We're breaking for coffee and with the exhibitors for the next 30 minutes, and I encourage you to attend another educational session being offered this afternoon, and please refer to that mobile app or your program for additional details. I want to thank all four of our guests for a really interesting and illuminating session, and thank you all for being here. Thank you.